Yes, hello. This morning to our lecture in macroeconomics. Well, we are just at the topic that we are talking about money and how our money in our times comes into the economy. And yeah, we started to talk about what is, so to speak, the monetary base. And this is not very surprisingly due to the central bank. So in general, we could say that the balance sheet of the central bank is more or less the monetary base, and at liability, we also see, of course, the currency in circulation, what is more or less the cash money. But of course, then we talked about the definition of money. Remember M1, M2, and M3. And there, we of course also defined as money our credit cards, our banking cards, digital possibilities to pay, and so on. And also we talked about that if you have a bank account with longer maturities than overnight, as in your general direct account with maturity, that we talk about money, so to speak, with roughly maturities of bank accounts roughly up to 2 years. So many things of the money creation process therefore comes from the private banks, and this is the so-called active money creation. And the function of this was quite easy, that we say, well, of course, there starts more or less one bank with deposits of 1 million euros in our example, and then they had some reserve requirement. In this case, we talked about 10%, and then this multiplier process is initiated, that the first bank gives 900,000 euros of credit to some person. This person in general will have its bank account at another bank. So then appears at another bank additionally 900,000 euros. But the persons who made the deposits of 1 million euros at the first bank, of course, they act like they have 1 million euros. The second person now has taken credit in volume of 900,000. He or she also now acts as she has 900,000 euros. She can start to buy things. Then the third bank, there appears also 90% of 900,000, and so on, so on, and so on. And if we add up all these numbers, 900, 810, 729, then of course we have to add up an infinite number of euros. But since this is the so-called geometric series, this is more or less just a growth process, as you should have seen it many times. We know that these series then ends in 1 over 1 minus 0.9 times 1 million. So we end up at 10 million euros. Because we know that this geometric series has a finite limit. And if we, I didn't wrote it down here, insert there our reserve requirement of 10%, then in general we could insert 1 over 1 minus 1 minus r, and this then ends up in 1 over r, and these 1 over r, 1 over the reserve requirement, we called the money multiplier. And please remember this process in general in an abstract way, because later on when we looked at economic theory, there this multiplier process will appear again. Oh, there it is. Okay, on the next slide. And here we had on this general slide also this result generally derived. Okay, and then after we have talked about money appears in our economy, we started to talk about monetary policy, and there the general goal of monetary policy, as we talked also in the magic square, is the price stability. And for Europe, for the Eurozone, this is defined as that we define price stability if we have in the medium term roughly 2% of inflation measured via the harmonized index of consumer prices. And we also have to keep in mind that this target is symmetrically around 2%. In the starting time of the Eurozone, this goal wasn't symmetrically defined. There we had the definition 2%, but not higher than 2%. And then, we changed it some years ago. And the reason for this was that maybe we don't remember it anymore. We had more or less 10 years of inflation with much below than 2%. So we always wished to have higher inflation rates. And one reason was then that we changed this goal in order that we also say, okay, if we have some time of 2 or 3 or 4% inflation, this doesn't matter because now our goal is defined in a symmetric way. Okay, then we talked about the general instruments of monetary policy. So how to achieve this goal of stable prices defined by 2% inflation. And the classical key instrument are the so-called main refinancing operations. So this is the operation where the central bank gives the central bank money to the private banks, and these banks obtain these central bank money via main refinancing operations, and the price of this money is the so-called key interest rate. And then we have a corridor around this key interest rate, the deposit facility and the marginal lending facility. This is, so to speak, something like an insurance. If the cash management of the private banks doesn't really work, so they have always the possibility, if they have more central bank money they need, they can put it in the so-called deposit facility, but for a lower interest rate. In general, this interest rate will be lower than the market interest rate. So in general, this is not very attractive to do this, but in the last years, there were 3-digit billions of euros in this deposit facility. And the reason is that we trust the central bank more than the other banks around me. So I really was at a private banker in the situation that I thought maybe something like Lehman Brothers happens again. So I just put my money for a lower price, for lower interest rate to the central bank, and the other way around. If my cash management didn't work like that I need money because of the reserve requirements and I don't have the central bank money, then I always could go to the central bank and ask them for additional money, but now, of course, for a higher interest rate than the key interest rate, and therefore also a higher interest rate than the market interest the market interest rates. And of course, in times before our crises, the last 10, 15 years, this was also very, very unattractive. Or if you must go to the central bank and ask them for this marginal lending facility, this just meant, well, the other neighbor bank doesn't give you any money, so you have some problems. But also the last years, because the private banks didn't trust in general each other. Also, we saw their relevant amounts of money in this marginal lending facility. And the last classical monetary instrument, of course, we talked about this already, the minimum reserve. And then quite often in an economy, we talk about the interest rate in a country. But the interest rate we don't have because, of course, we have different different bonds with different maturities, and so in general we have different interest rates. And then we know these key interest rate, they have what I think 1 week or something like this. We had here maturities of around 1 week. So we are just want to steer via the central bank the very short term interest rate in the market. And then we can ask, how does this short term interest rate feed into the system? And this is again, of course, just thinking in alternatives. If, for example, short term interest rates via a cut in the key interest rate going down, then short-term bonds will be less attractive than longer-term bonds. So I move to longer-term bonds, then the prices of longer-term bonds will rise. So the yield of longer-term bonds will then also drop. And so we can say it starts from the short-term interest rates and then feed through the whole system. But anyhow, in the general, we will see different interest rates for different maturities, and this is the so-called yield curve. And about this yield curve, we will talk today in detail because we had this talk on Monday of, try to make a good investment. And Dr. Jörg talked about also, how to get a good signal where we are in the business cycle. And he talked about some expectation indicators. And we will also talk about a very famous expectation indicator, especially if there's a crisis coming or not. And this expectation indicator will be the yield curve in general, and we will talk about this in a minute. But before that, we started, to talk about in general, at first, how a cut in the key interest rate feed into the system for all interest rates, and then we talked about how yeah, is the functionality changing the interest rate, what happens in the economy in general, and of course, what happens for in the economy for GDP growth. And yeah, a very direct form is, of course, if we cut interest rates and then assume, okay, not one-to-one, but a cut in key interest rates means that in general, the level of the interest rates in the economy will fall. Then, of course, credits become cheaper, and of course, investments is mainly financed via credits, but also consumption is financed via credits. So it is easier to get money for consumption and money for investment. This will, of course, then utilize the production. This will, in general, push economic growth because demand is rising. But then, if we are going, just think of the business cycle. If we are moving to the limit of capacity, then still pushing the economy via increasing demands with low interest rates cannot anymore increase production because we are already at the limit of our capacity. And this, of course, will then have the effect that profits will stagnate, or even the expectation of the future profits will fall. And this then means in the business cycle, we will move on to the downturn. And if we then still have a scenario with very low interest rates, this in general will then only push prices. And this is quite good explainable via our quantitative theory of money, because we cannot limit of capacity anymore increase production, our Y. On the other side, money is still very cheap, and then we have this one-to-one mapping, because the velocity of money only changes very slowly during time. Y, GDP, real GDP, cannot increase anymore, and then an increase of money will only increase prices of the other side. Okay, and then we can also talk about an indirect way how this feeds through the system, because of course interest rates are a very important price of capital markets. Not only the price of credits, but of capital markets in general, because these interest rates represent more or less the yield of our bonds. And then, of course, we can invest not only in bonds, so in in a secure, so to speak, investment. But of course, we also can invest in the stock market. And now, if via the central bank, via a cut of key interest rates, the yield of bonds will decrease, then again, thinking in alternatives, opportunity costs, we will start to move our investment to the stock market, because then we think, okay, there will be still a higher yield. But then, and this is the same argumentation as we had it between short-term bonds and long-term bonds, where we said that at first we are steering via the central bank the short-term bonds. Now also means if the demand in the stock market will increase, then of course prices will rise. The DAX, the Dow Jones, and so on will rise. And this, of course, then you have to pay more for your stocks, will say that also your yield there will drop down. And this is then just an equilibrium process, and this will go on and go on and go on until the point where then the yield in the stock market will more or less be equal to the yield of bonds, so to the new level of interest rates. So, but what then happened? Well, we have many people who are already owners of stocks. And if stock market prices increase, their income will increase. So they will be richer. And then remember your argumentation from your microeconomic courses. If you have in general normal goods, what will happen if I'm richer? If my income will rise, then my demand will increase. This is a general assumption or what we see in practice, that richer people will buy, of course, in general, more things, more goods and services. And so from this increase of income now, again, we will have a higher demand for consumption and investment goods. And then we can just jump to the former slide. Let me make a star here. And we just jump to that point, and then the same argumentation starts here. First, increase of utilization. So also via this indirect effect, we get a push on the economy. But if we then at the limit of the capacity of our economy, again, we have to be careful, because otherwise, in the end, this money creation process via low interest rates will only increase prices. And yeah, maybe especially in Europe, we haven't seen this point, that there was this danger last year and we still didn't do anything against it. But right now, I think next Thursday, there will be the next decision of the European Central Bank. And the expectation is that we will see 100 basis points or something like this again. So we are just moving behind the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, but now, where was it? Here. Now we want to talk about the yield curve in general, because, well, if we take this argumentation, then maybe only for some time there should be a difference between interest rates for different maturities. But what we see is that in general, that for longer maturities, we have higher interest rates. This we call a normal yield curve. But we see sometimes also the other way around, that short-term interest rates are higher than long-term. Short-term interest rates are higher than long-term interest rates. So in general, what we very rarely see is a very flat yield curve where all interest rates are more or less the same. So what we want to talk about now is what could be the reasons that we have different interest rates for different maturities. And for this, we will start with a short example, which hopefully explains you the so-called market expectation theory for the yield curve. In order to get the argument behind this, we have to make very hard assumptions. We will go through these assumptions, and please keep in mind, in practice, these assumptions will not be fulfilled. but we are now talking theoretically about it, and then we really need to fix ourselves and then start to think about it from these fixed assumptions, and then what this would mean. In practice, of course, there will be also some colors of gray, so to speak, that they are not 100% fulfilled. But let's start. Of course, we should have a short-term interest rate, I1. This should be a bond with maturity 1 year with an interest rate of 2%. Then a bond maturity 2 years and an interest rate on with 4%. And what I missed is we want also to assume revolving investment. So this means with this bond of a maturity of 2 years, after 1 year I will have, if I invest €1 with 4%, €1.04, and then in the second year I will invest €1.04 again with 4%. So, and now we make our hard assumptions, and the first one should be that short-term investment and long-term investment should be perfect substitutes. Perfect substitutes, you know also, I think, from your business administration courses, microeconomic theory, and so on. This just means I'm not thinking about which good I have. I just can, from utility, I just can interchange these goods. Of course, long-term and short-term investments are different goods. In practice, they will not be perfect substitutes, but right now, we just think of it that we don't care that we have here a short-term investment and a longer-term investment. And the second one is also that I'm risk neutral. And what does risk neutrality in this case means? Well, of course, we can think of I give my money for 2, 3, 4, or 5 years to some other person or to a bank. Then, of course, I think about the case that tomorrow this bank won't be there anymore. I made you this short video about bank runs. This was the main assumption, that the people think about that tomorrow the bank is not anymore and I don't get my money back. But in our case here, we want to abstract from this possibility, because this, of course, would then mean that a longer term investment would have a higher risk. But now we also say that we don't care about this. Of course, also in general, we find that people on average are risk averse. But here we will also skip on this and just say we are risk neutral in our case. Okay. And now we start to compare our two investments. Oh no, of course, also with the assumption of perfect capital markets. What does perfect capital markets mean? Perfect capital markets mean that we have always a very liquid market. So if I want to make with a specific volume and investment, then I find the bond. I do not have to search there. I just say, well, I want to invest for 2 years. I want €1 million to invest for 4 years and so on. So I have a very liquid market, and also there are no capital controls. So there is no country which prohibits me to invest anymore, anything. Or what we find in practice also is, if you want to invest as a foreigner in another country, that you have to pay for it. So also this we will also skip in our model here. So perfect substitutes, risk neutrality, and perfect capital markets. So, and now we want to compare these two investment possibilities, or again, thinking in alternatives. So we just start what happens if we invest €1 short term 1 year. This would mean €1 times 1 plus 2%. And long term €1 times 1.4%. And now revolving investment. So in the second year, 1 plus 4% additionally multiplied. Okay, now we look at it. Then, of course, this number will be greater or larger than this one. Is it now better to invest in the longer term? This number is larger. Maybe at a first shot, yes. But then if we think about it, well, still we are comparing not the same things.
For example, the long term, we need to wait years to get our value. It might be this year.
Yeah.
Don't know what it is.
Yes, actually. Definitely, definitely. Because now we are comparing two things which we cannot compare. So, what we have to do, we have to try to rise the maturity of our investment, of this short-term investment. Well, and now this assumption of perfect capital markets come into our mind, and then we say, well, we always can invest the amount we want. So here, after 1 year, we have our €1, 2 cents. And now we can say, I don't know the interest rate tomorrow, but I know that I can tomorrow invest also for 1 year. And then this I defined as 1IE for the expected short-term interest rate in the future. And then I think, well, in order to compare, I make some expectations about the interest rate, the short-term interest rate tomorrow. And I know I can invest my money in 1 year with this expected short-term interest rate. So I multiply this with 1 plus I1E. And now I can compare these two investments. Well, there will be the people which say, well, I start with this short-term investment, and then I make my expectations about the short-term interest rates tomorrow. And then they compare these two yields. And of course, if these two yields differ, on average, the people will move on the one side. Maybe this is higher than due to my expectations than the left side. Then I will move to the longer term investments, or the other way around. Then I move out of my long-term investments and move to the left. But what happens again? Well, if there is a difference in the yields, prices of the bonds of the one or the other side will start to increase. And of course, we have again this market equilibrium process, and also we have perfect capital markets. We don't care about long-term, short-term, perfect substitutes, and we are risk neutral. So from these three assumptions, what must then happen? Yes, so that within this equilibrium process, they should be after some time equal. So, and very important in a minute is that this equality sign, this is not a law. This comes from the argumentation and our assumptions here. So this more or less say that, I don't know if you have already introduced this word, that we have a arbitrage free market. What does this mean? I have an arbitrage free market. Well, you can think of the yield or the interest rate also that it is the price for your investment, or of course also for your credit. Now we don't want to distinguish at that point of our lecture between deposit interest rates and the investment interest rates. In practice, there will be a slight difference, but now we assume that they are the same. So if, for example, here the yield, the interest rate would be lower, then I could say, okay, I investing 2 terms in a short way for a low, I'm taking a credit for a lower interest rate, 2 times short-term investment, taking the money and investing this, which I obtained with a low interest rate as a credit, and I invest it with a higher yield. And this would be then a so-called free lunch. But there we say, well, investors look in the world for these free lunches, but then many investors move to these free lunches, and then again we have the equilibrium process, and the yields have to be equal in the end. Okay, there was a question.
First €1,
Mm-hmm.
and then for the second, plus percent interest rate,
Mm-hmm.
and for the first one, plus.
This should be also a 4, so sorry. Oops, then let me write it in a better way.
And this scheme also for the shorter years, P1E, the I1E,
Yeah.
the long-term years.
Yes, because you can today you can go to your bank and you say, well, let's say not €1. You say, well, I have €1,000, and then you can ask, I give you my money for 1 year, and then your bank will give you the answer. Well, in my example, for 1 year you will get 2%. Or you can say to your investment officer, €1,000, and I don't need it for the next 2 years. What will be the interest rate? This yield curve here, or then let's just go to the internet. So there's no picture, sorry. I think at Bloomberg we will have one. Yeah. No picture, but here you see 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, and here you have your yield 2% and a bit higher, and for 30 years even a bit lower. So this is the today yield curve for Germany. So we know, and this is very important now, we know today I1 and I2, but I don't know I1E. This is the short-term interest rate tomorrow or in 1 year. But now I deduced from these assumptions here that I have here an equality sign. So let's calculate just the brackets. At first we see the amount of investment cancels out, and then we obtain 1 plus 2% plus 1 IE plus 2% I1E equals 1 plus 4% plus 4% plus 4% squared. This 1 cancels, and then we make again the assumption I talked quite often about is that we have here the product of two interest rates, and here also, so to speak, two interest rates. Two times the same interest rates, but these are also still the product of two interest rates. And if these product of two interest rates, this we will skip if we assume that interest rates will be lower than 10%. You remember? Let's say here in our example, 0.4 times 0.4 is 0.0016, and this is much less than 0.04 itself. So since this is a product of two interest rates, we skip these terms if interest rates lower than 10%. Well, we are still in these situations. Let's see how this process of rising interest rates via the central banks will go on. This, of course, depends how long we will have very high inflation rates. But right now, it is still a quite good assumption that you say that we have interest rates lower than 10%. So then we leave these two terms. We skip these two terms, and now we have something, a really fine thing for economists, because now we subtract these 2%. Both sides, so this vanish on the left side, and then we have 1I1E equals, and let me write it like this, 4% plus 4% minus 2%. Of course, you don't need mathematically this bracket, and we can calculate this, and then we will have 6%, of course. But let me write it like this, and especially look at this one here. Actually, if we just take the numbers, then we see short-term expected interest rates will be 6%. Short-term interest rates today are 2%. So what we then can say from the market, and the yield curve just represents the today market of bonds, the prices of bonds, the yields of bonds. So then we can say the market in this situation, in my example, expects that short-term interest rates will rise. And when does this will in general happen? This will, of course, in general happen when this bracket here is larger than 0. So this is then, the main thing we have to think about is this bracket larger or lower than 0. Well, and then what do we find in this bracket? This is the long-term interest rate. And this is the short-term interest rate. Well, and then we can say if especially short-term interest rates are larger than long-term interest rates, we can deduce from the yield curve that market expectations are that short-term interest rate will decrease. And then we move to the point what we have learned about monetary policy. We have learned that with the key interest rate of the central bank, we want to steer short-term interest rates. So then the next step in our argumentation is we have a look at the yield curve. Maybe we find a situation with short-term interest rates higher than long-term interest rates. First point, market expectations are that short-term interest rates will decrease. Second, what we know from monetary policy, okay, this will happen when key interest rates of the central bank will fall if they cut interest rates. So also market expectations is that tomorrow central banks will cut interest rates. And now we go to the business cycle. When will it happen in general that central banks will cut interest rates? In which kind of an economic situation will we be? In a risk of deflation, yeah, okay, but this is already a step further. This is okay, yeah. Yes, in a recession, or if we see, okay, the downturn will be longer than and there is no sun at the morning. So if we are in hard times in our economy, so if we are in the downturn or if we are already in the crisis. So then we really can say this yield curve is an indicator for the downturn or an indicator for the crisis. From this argumentation, which we here have made, because also we made here quite hard assumptions. But then, and let's just jump to this picture here. These are historical yield curves, and more or less this is almost the actual yield curve of Germany today, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Oh, this has to be maturity here. And these are interest rates. So what I brought you is here in November 2000. This is more or less a quite normal. Why we call longer term interest rates higher than short term interest rates, we will talk in a minute about it. So this we call a quite normal situation. And then I brought you also the yield curve of Germany on the 15th of September in 2008. And I brought you the yield curve, the gray one here, of 6th of March 2020. Maybe we take at first the yield curve March, the beginning of March 2020. What happened there? Or what has happened there? Yep.
It went into the negative interest rate, -1.
Okay, you look at this here. Well, this was a situation we were already quite in a quite negative part in interest rates, but this has last. I think this started The first time 10-year bond negative interest rate, I think in 2013 or 14, this started. So it was quite low, but this was during these times, yeah, nothing new. But don't look at the interest, at the yield curve, look at the date. What happened, not exactly at the 6th of March, but what happened in Europe, in the United States, in the whole world in the beginning of March 2020. Was it really the Corona crisis what happened? Really, the economic crisis? What started in the beginning of March, 2 years ago, 2.5 years? No, no, this was in April. In the beginning of March, the number of counted infected people in Germany was lower than 100 for the whole country. I remember this because our lecture in summer term started at this time, and then I made this little calculation with my students. So we started. I think the first infected people in Germany was counted in around 20th of February. And then we saw that we have a doubling of the corona infections, I think, in 1 week. But we started at in the midst or in the beginning of February. So 6 times doubling just means 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on. And then I estimated with my students how long will it take until Germany, the whole population of Germany will be infected. This you can, if you take a doubling time of 1 week, just calculate this. But the number was below 100 for the whole country. So most people still thought, well, there is something, there will be maybe some problem, but compared to the SARS pandemic or to the SARS epidemic 15 years ago in South Korea, in East Asia, well, this is more or less a problem of the Chinese people. This is more or less only a problem of Asia. It will not be too tough for us. This were during these times the general expectations, and then in April, just 2 months later, we went in the first very sharp lockdown. So at this date, more or less, we said, well, let's see. Not everything is okay, but there will not be very much. But what we see here, we have a so-called inverse yield curve. So the yield curve started to invert quite a time earlier than the general expectations in society, in the economy said, well, there will be something. And the other date here, 15th of, so first corona infections in Germany. 15th of September. Anybody know this date? Pardon? 2008. Yeah. Yes, this is the day before the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. The next day, on the 16th, the sixth largest investment bank of the world crashed. So this is Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. Well, and also in August, September 2008, this was my time at the Council of Economic Advisors here in Germany and the scientific staff. Also, at this time, the general argumentation, what will happen? Well, we saw that already some banks in the United States, in UK, have problems, but still the general argumentation was, well, there is some financial crisis. There are some problems especially in the housing market of the United States. But we also saw at this time a barrel price of oil of 150 US dollars, so 50 US dollar more than today. And when do we have very high oil prices? Well, if we are in a boom, if there is a high demand for energy, and also oil is the main good for the chemical industry. And there we had the highest prices of oil ever. 50 US dollars more than now. So in general, there is maybe some problems in the financial markets, but there will nothing feed through to the to the real economy. But what you see here is strong inverted yield curve from 1 year to 5 years, almost 100 basis points. And so here in these two cases, we had that this yield curve, due to this argumentation, was really right. That there will be a problem tomorrow for the whole economy. And if you, in a minute, go to other crises in history, we always saw an inverse yield curve when a really hard crisis was coming or has come later on. So this is actually a very good indicator. Oops, where we are? No, here. But unfortunately, we do not see the inversion of the yield curve 3 months, 4 months, 5 months or so before the crisis starts. But I say right now we have, due to the increase of the key interest rates of the central banks worldwide, we have this shift again of the yield curve in the positive part. But I would really have a deep look at this part of the first part, let's say up to 5 years maturity. If this part moves faster upwards, so that we get a flat or even a slight inverse part within this moving up process, because that we will go on in this shifting process. This is more or less clear, since the central banks will go on and rise interest rates the next month. But if this first part, this short-term interest rate part, will move faster upwards, then for me this will be really a signal that there is coming something bad. Yep. Hmm? Oh no, this is This is not nothing really. Oh, yeah. Where does it come from? Sorry. So this is just only an example for a more or less normal situation. This is just today, almost. Let's say almost today. Okay, and then let's also talk about the argumentation why we call this a normal yield curve or a maturity. Well, there, I think a quite easy argumentation is, think you give credit to your friend and he asks you for the credit of 2 or 3 years, then, and you have the money, you give him the money, and then of course you say, well, today I don't need the money, but maybe in 1 or 2 years I want to make a larger investment, or I want to buy a car or something like this, and then I will need these, let's assume 10,000 euros or so. Then, of course, because you during this time are illiquid, you still have the money because you gave the credit to another guy, but you cannot get the money next year or in 2 years if the maturity is 3 or 4 years. And for this, you then want to have a higher interest rate. And therefore, this is called the liquidity premium theory, because you want to have a premia for giving your money a longer time away. But of course, this liquidity premium theory we can easily incorporate in the market expectation theory. Then we, so to speak, just add this liquidity premium within the longer term interest rate. Then we can say, well, they are higher, 4% here, but maybe 100 basis point, so 1 percentage point is just liquidity theory. So the interest rate I have to calculate for the market expectation theory would then be not 4%, but 3%. So this is nothing what cannot be easily done. And there is a last theory, but actually we don't see this theory really in practice in the data. But since if you look at books and if you read about the yield curve, I will give you also the argumentation here and there. Oh, this is again Germany. This I have to translate. This means if you are an investor, and then we assume that you maybe want to invest, let's say, 7 years. But in the market, you find only an investment possibility which lasts 10 years. For example, 10 years. What does this then mean? Well, if you can only invest in a bond with a maturity of 10 years, but you want to invest only 7 years, then you have to sell the bond earlier. So you don't get your invested 100 out of it. You get after 7 years the price out of it. It could be higher than 100, but of course it could be also lower than 100. And therefore we say if investment horizon and maturity you find do not match, that you have a price risk if the maturity is larger than your investment horizon. The other way around, the argumentation is if maybe again 7 years, but we find only an investment possibility of 5 years, then of course after 5 years we have to reinvest our money because we need the other 2 years, but we don't know what is the yield in 5 years for another 2 years. And therefore we talk in this case about an income risk. So, and if these investment horizon and maturities does not match in general, then we can think of that the market segmentates within, let's say, a short-term segment, a medium-term segment, and a longer-term segment. And for all these 3 segments, we will find then different prices, different interest rates. But if we look at the data, this market segmentation is not really found in practice. But it is also an argumentation where you can then argue that you have different interest rates for different maturities. Okay, that it was. And then on Thursday, we will talk also about monetary policy in the end, and then we are more or less with our descriptive part done. And after that, we will start with a more theoretical topic in our lecture. Thank you very much for today.